Every book needs a focus, a theme, a hook. But what if that theme encompasses an entire continent? Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. This is Molly Stevens, and today Kate Leahy and I are going to talk to someone from across the pond, a UK-based author, Lerato Umah-Shaylor. Hey, Kate.
Hey, Molly.
So remember back, I think it was episode 52, we talked to Matt Sartwell from Kitchen Arts and Letters. He said that great thing about the world is full of unexplored territory. And then he went on to talk about some of those places, and he mentioned Africa, and he just said that Africa is just so underrepresented in cookbooks.
It really is. I'm sure he's looking to add to his shelf, and I'm sure there's a lot of other cookbook sellers who would love more opportunities to sell people African books, because I'm sure people are asking for them.
Yeah. It was interesting. Matt was talking about how vast it is and how it's not a mono cuisine. I mean, it's richly diverse culturally, geographically. But we are going to talk to someone today who took on the entire continent in one book.
In her first book, too.
Her first book, yeah. Talk about audacious.
Audacious. And what a beautiful book it is, too. I can't wait to talk to her a little bit more about just the design, the layout. It's just really vibrant.
Yep. And it's a book that was published first in the UK. There's a US edition has just been published. Lerato Umah-Shaylor is a food writer, chef, TV presenter, cooking teacher, brand ambassador. She's got a Substack newsletter. She was born in Nigeria and she now lives in Sussex, England. We're going to talk to her today about all of that and her first cookbook, Africana. Well, Lerato, welcome to Everything Cookbooks.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
We're so excited to have you here, and just congratulations on the gorgeous book, Africana.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a labor of love.
Yeah, I'm sure. We there's so much we want to talk to you about, but I think we're going to start. And if you could tell us about your book journey. We read somewhere that it took years to get this book published. And so how did it start, and where did the kernel of the idea come from?
It took me maybe 6, 7, or maybe 8 years, but that doesn't mean that I was writing it for all this time. I'd just been gathering my stories, writing the recipes without really being very intentional about where it was going. I just personally had this desire to treasure the recipes, and then I started teaching the recipes. So I started by creating a cookery school, because I thought, if I want these recipes to last, if I want people to learn more about them, I need to teach, I need to share them beyond just hosting supper clubs, which is what I was doing. I'd have guests come to my event and they'd be like, oh, I really like that. Like, how do you make that? And then I'd be teaching them at the dinner party. And I thought I might as well just have a cookery school where you can come and learn all this wonderful African food that you've been missing all your life. So I started writing. And to be honest, a lot of the stories as well are things that I wrote maybe 8 or 9 years ago when I was writing for a newspaper or traveling. I just always had it in me to document these things, almost like I knew. But honestly, at the time, I can't tell you that I've been dreaming for 10 years of writing a book. No. Maybe for the past 5 or 6 years, it became more obvious that I had so much to say. It was like I was gagging to share such a wealth of information. Yeah. I literally felt like I just needed to bring it out. And I'd met my publishers and I was told, send something in. But I procrastinated for so long. My mother says that just means I wasn't ready. I think there was also a lack of confidence that it was something that the world wanted or would like. Even now, people say things like, it's so niche. I wonder if it'll sell. But now, I'm more ballsy about these things. I'm like, food of an entire continent like Africa, too niche. I'm like, okay, I'll show
niche.
you.
I'm like, yeah.
Well, I'll show you niche.
I wanted to ask you, right, because you could have written a book that was solely about one country in Africa, and that would have filled a book. So,
yes.
But you didn't do that. You took on a continent. So can you just tell us a little bit about why you felt you needed to do that in this book?
Yeah.
Especially, it's a huge undertaking.
Yes, how dare she? I have people who pick up the book and they say, oh, Africana. So is it about Nigerian food? I'm like, no, it doesn't say Nigeriana. It says Africana. It literally says it, treasured recipes and stories from across the continent. So I started writing a Nigerian book, but then it didn't really feel natural to me, even though I'm Nigerian. Growing up, I traveled across Africa. I have a huge appetite for the whole continent, not just for Nigeria. So when I started writing and I was focusing on just Nigerian recipes, honestly, I got bored. It was like I was over before I began. And I found myself naturally leaning towards other countries with foods that I enjoyed. So to be honest, writing a book about the entire continent was easier for me than writing about Nigeria, where my family is actually from. And they say, write what you know. So this is not to say that I know everything about the whole continent, but I know a lot because I have that appetite. So I've been gathering the stories, gathering the recipes. If I get into a taxi and the person looks African, I'll ask them, so, what's your heritage? What kind of food do you eat? What does your wife cook or your family cook? So I talk to people a lot. I learn a lot. I've had many, many years talking to the African mamas in different countries. So I just had a lot of inspiration just bursting. So it was most natural.
Wow.
Your supper club and the cookery school that you started at, through that supper club, that was also sort of a Pan-African.
Yes, it was.
You've always been.
It always has been Pan-African. So I had a lot of joy and pride in marrying foods from the West, the East, the North, the South. So in my home and in friends' homes that I've witnessed, how they dine, people would tend to pair their country food together, Nigerian foods with other Nigerian accompaniments, and not Nigerian and South African and, East African. So I always did that in my home, but I noticed that others didn't do that. So my supper clubs and my cookery classes, we would have a 3, 4, 5 course, a selection of meals or recipes from different parts of the continent that married very well together. And people would suddenly start thinking, oh, I could try that. It's just taking them out of their box. So that worked for Africans. And then for non-Africans, it was just something brand new, that they'd never tried. Sometimes even non-Africans, they may have tried 1 or 2 things because they traveled there or they have a friend from that country. So for me, it was really, really fun developing these relationships and seeing what people liked and seeing how they connected with the recipes and the spices and the stories. Because a lot of my cooking is there's a lot of context and the story or some kind of history behind it. Because I feel like the cuisine as a whole, from different parts of the continent, a lot of people don't really connect with it because they just don't know a lot about it. They just don't know where to start. So I feel like giving them a human connection makes it easier. A lot of our stories, a lot of our connections with food is very similar, regardless of where you come from in the world. Either maybe your mother liked cooking greens or your father was a great baker. Whatever the story is, people connect with human stories. So I found that by sharing context, history, context, stories, people sort of engaged with the recipes better and could make it their own.
Let me ask you how you got involved with food in general, because you were studying economics, right? You were not supposed to become this globetrotting food writer writing cookbooks. And one thing that was really interesting in your introduction, you talked about how your mother, when she was in her early 20s, she had you, she's working at a restaurant, you're strapped to her chest. But then afterwards, you were not even allowed in the kitchen because it might be dangerous. You could get hurt and you were supposed to be doing probably school or something. So tell us about, you probably always had this love of food, but how did you make the leap from, oh, this is what I'm supposed to do, this is what my parents want me to do, to this is what I need to do?
Honestly, I think my journey is proof that some things are in our DNA. I wasn't really sure I believed that, but I think I do now. Food is in my family's DNA. My mother had a restaurant. I'm a chef and writer. My younger brother is a chef. We're just obsessed with cooking for others. And yes, my mother carried me on her back when she had a restaurant in her 20s. And it's a very typical thing of Nigerian parents. They want you to be doctors or lawyers, anything that sounds like you're going to make lots of money and be successful. will be their preference for you. So that was also my mom's preference for me. And then I did have a big interest in economics and international relations. I just always sort of fantasized about working in an environment where I was helping my country or helping my community, and not in a charitable way, just empowering them with something, whether it was finance or social issues. But halfway through study, I became disillusioned with international organizations. I just felt like it's just too much admin, too much bureaucracy, not enough results. And this is not putting down the amazing work that a lot of people do. I have a lot of friends that work across the world in lots of humanitarian and developmental issues. But personally, I just didn't really feel, I think I was a little bit naive about the institution. So I started to come away from that and engage more in my hobby. Cooking was really a hobby. I would go to a nice restaurant and talk to the waiter and, probe the chef, and then go back home and try to recreate those things. But prior to that, as a child, I'd been cooking in the kitchen. We had a chef growing up. He would teach me. My mother, didn't teach me as early as our chef did because she was worried about me being in the kitchen because she wanted me to focus on my studies.
Right.
So her priority was study and become this super successful woman. But then as I started to grow out of my mother's shadow and live on my own, I was leaning more into what I really enjoyed, which was food, and more so cooking for others. I really enjoy feeding people. Half the time, I don't really like cooking for myself. It's almost like I enjoy cooking for myself, but sometimes it's almost like a letdown. Like, am I going to be the only one to eat this food? So it's almost disappointing.
Oh, I know that feeling that it's there's so much more joy in sharing it with others. And that's really,
And just seeing the happiness on their faces.
Yeah. I love in your dedication, your mother who blessed you with great curiosity, and your grandma, you think she would be proud of this book.
I think
that's
she
lovely.
would.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
So I want to get back a little bit to the process of getting you said you met your publisher, you had this idea, the book was gurgling up in you, and then
I was introduced to my publisher. One of those, you go to an event, somebody else's, a friend and mentor's book launch, and then I was introduced. And those introductions, sometimes they mean something, sometimes it could be nothing. But I was introduced, which I think is a huge advantage. But she waited for almost 6 years for me to actually submit a book.
And did you submit a book, Lerato, or was it a proposal?
I submitted a proposal, but quite a fully formed proposal. I knew exactly what I wanted. The only thing I didn't know was the name of the book, but I knew what I wanted, the type of book I wanted, the message. My proposal had my marketing plan. Everything was in there. So I knew exactly what I wanted. My publisher had been watching me. I think she and they believed in me. But you see, it may sound, I had to grow a thick skin because we do live in a world that has not seemed to be very excited about African food. But then I took that on the chin and I said, maybe that's just because we haven't given them a lot of material to be excited about. Just like in retail, you know how they say they give the customers what they want. But do the customers tell them what they want? No.
That's so true. Sometimes the customers don't know what they want, but then they see something, they're like, now I know.
Exactly.
I want that.
So I took that sort of idea and also realized that there are a lot of people of African descent. Literally every brown person, most brown people are of African descent. So that's your bloodline, number one. And number two, it's a very, very influential continent. Even in the USA, a lot of the things that you eat are of African origin. Even what you call yams, which are not yams. They're another kind of sweet potato. I should write an article about that. That's, something that was originally the West African style yam. And then over time, you couldn't find that particular cultivar. And then you started calling what looked like it yams. Even cooking greens, your black-eyed beans, which you'd call black-eyed peas, okra, gumbo. That's all African food that has transcended and moved from Africa and merged with other cultures to become something else. So I realized that there's a big connection. It's not true that we're the other. We are you know, we are more linked than many people realize. So I thought that empowered me. And I thought, I'm gonna really share what I know and do more research to make those connections so that people realize just how important, influential, similar, and how relevant a lot of these recipes from across the continent really are.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about that research. I mean, how did you do your research?
Yeah, I love the idea of getting into taxis and asking the drivers, talking to chefs, talking to friends and friends' aunts and all these other people. Because another thing I'm thinking is if you're doing a lot of different countries, they might have similar dishes, but with different names or same ingredients, but they call them different things.
That's another thing. And that was the most challenging one. Learning or deciding how to represent a dish that is something else somewhere else. So the first thing I decided was I'm Nigerian and I know a lot about Nigerian food. So I made sure I wrote a lot about the things that were closest to me, I had more access to, and a stronger experience with. So we have recipes like the egusi soup and pounded yam. That's probably the first thing my mom taught me before I left home to boarding school. So I wrote that. And then other recipes that perhaps I learned from my mother or an auntie, I just went back to them to just ask for. And the thing about a lot of African recipes, and this is across the board, nobody's writing it down. Right. There's no encyclopedia or, reference point. And you must understand, I identify as an African woman and all my inspiration is mostly from Africans and not from the West. So there may have been people that are Western, African American or British or American who have written about African foods, but they don't form the basis of my context. My context is from the African voice. So my African references are my mother, my grandmother, the market women on the street. While I was writing for a newspaper, I would be standing on the street and asking them, so why are you cooking the corn, this way? Why are you doing this? Why are you soaking the corn in water before you whack it on the grill? Why are you doing that? So I learned a lot from, African people and just asking questions. And then the countries that I hadn't visited or didn't know a lot about, I'd make friends. I'd reach out to chefs, reach out to people that I thought were interesting. Or if I noticed a recipe online from somebody, I'd reach out to them. There's a chef in Australia that I reached out to. We became quite chatty friends over the pandemic. She's from Ethiopia, but she lives in Australia. So we talked a lot about, how she cooks in her home. And I asked her a question. I said, injera, for example, which is the Ethiopian flour bread that's quite fluffy. It's practically their spoon. I asked her, I said, do you make your own injera? Because in the West, people get excited about making their injera. They want medals, for learning how to make it. She said, no, we just buy it from the shop.
We just buy it, right.
And for me, that was important context because a lot of Westerners want to respect us and they want to show that, oh, no, I did it from scratch, everything from scratch, which has its own novelty. It's lovely to be able to do it. But the actual country woman does not care about cooking it from scratch. But there's a reason as well, because the older woman in Ethiopia or Eritrea is mostly at home and she has time to make injera, while the younger ones these days are going out to work. And so there's a cultural context behind why women are not just sitting down at home making injera. And I also specifically didn't want to highlight those cultural tropes, like, African women, are not educated and they just have all the time in the world.
Yeah. And that comes through in this book very much.
I hope so. Yeah. So the research was daunting at first, but I just took it in my stride. And, I started by writing what I knew best, Nigerian recipes, East African recipes that I'd cooked myself, I'd learned from traveling, even having a random conversation with a friend. I've got a very good friend, Mboni. She's a professor in Tanzania. And we're just chatting about curries one day. She's telling me about I'm like, what is your favorite curry or a sauce that your mother used to cook? And she told me about this dish her mother would make. And it was like a coconut curry. And it was really interesting because her mother always wanted that dish when they lived in Switzerland and her mother was pregnant. So at the time, her mother would, struggle to find coconut milk. There's a time coconut milk was like a big deal. You couldn't find it anywhere.
Right.
Unless you cracked an actual coconut. This is in the West. So her mother would, struggle to find coconut milk. And she would make that recipe and save like a thick part of the milk, save some. And at the end, drizzle some more. And I thought, wow, why did she do that? And the reason was that it just lifts the dish at the end, at the very end, the creaminess that you've added while cooking it, you lose a bit of it, but by adding another drizzle of coconut milk, you give it that sweetness and freshness at the end. So little things like that you learn. Before she knew it, it found its way into my book.
Well, I love that because what you're doing is this is firsthand research. This isn't pulling from something that might have changed in translation. It might have changed if it was developed in the UK or the US or Australia. But if it came from the continent originally, then you're really getting firsthand information that hasn't really been written down in the way you've done it in this book, because now Molly and I can have this reference. We can read about, I just really want to ask you about your whole section on plantains.
Yes.
At the end of the book, there is this big thing about just how to buy and cook plantains. Tell us about that, because it's kind of unusual. You would think sometimes in a cookbook, maybe the editor would say, you don't need this, or this, why are you putting this in? So tell us a little bit about just that plantain section and why it was important.
The plantain section was, I wanted it to be as basic as possible, something that me and my African friends or Caribbean friends or people that are used to cooking might find redundant. Like, why is she teaching us how to cook plantain? But because I teach a lot, I realize that a lot of people don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to buy it. They don't know the differences. They don't know how to cook it. So it's actually one of the most important sections in my book that people find really helpful because it breaks everything down. So sometimes I'd have a cookery class and we have plantain. I just write plantain, then I realize, oh, they bought the wrong one. I've got to specify. It's got to be either yellow or green. And then even when I mention the type of plantain, people still buy the green one because that's what they saw. So I was like, people are not getting that. There's a reason why you have to buy a specific one for a specific dish. So after many years of teaching, I realized I've just got to lay this down clearly in the book so that they know that, okay, there's a process, there's a reason why this type of plantain is meant for this. And that's why I created that. It was really, and I remember one of my editors, I said, how do we depict the plantains as opposed to just mentioning it? And she was like, let's just have all the different kinds, the unripe one, which is the green, the ripe yellow, and the black one. So if you haven't read it, at least you can see that there are 3 different stages. I also have a section where I teach you the basics. So how to fry plantain, how to roast, how to boil. And all those tips you can carry along throughout the book because the book has recipes that have plantains in different forms. I have plantain shakshuka. I have a fried plantain with crab and a basil and edible flour salad. I have a plantain curry that uses the green plantains. So for me, it's one of my favorite parts of the book and one that I get feedback from cooks and my readers saying that they really found this useful.
It makes so much sense hearing you explain it because I was going to ask about the generosity of this book. There is this spirit. The boldness. I wish there were a way to, this is an audio, so we can't, but the colors in this book and everything about it just has this, the word audacity keeps coming in the most positive sense. There's just this boldness, but there's also this generosity in your writing in that the storytelling, which you've already talked about, like how important that is to put things in context, but then all the tips and the long head notes. And now I'm hearing you talk about the teaching and it's coming from that is you really want to get people to succeed with these recipes.
Yes, I want my cooks to succeed. That was really,
You say there are about 100 recipes in this book?
Over 100. I got tired of counting.
Yeah, okay.
So you just rounded.
Yeah.
But given the scope of what you're trying to do, that process of narrowing it down to over 100 recipes must have been an enormous undertaking because if you started with what you knew and what, you are learning and represented. And then you wanted to add to it all these things to represent other countries that you might not have visited. How did you balance that structure? Because the chapters are very well balanced. And
I'm so glad you say that. Honestly, this gave me the biggest anxiety, constantly worrying that perhaps I was representing one without the other. And, I'm conscious of the fact that as a Nigerian, we are very hyper-visual. So I didn't want the book to be too Nigerian and not much of anyone else. I even had some colleagues say, oh, I would have rather had less Maghreb things in them. I'm like, well, it's not your book. You know what I mean? I love North African food. And I find that in the media, it's almost like a lot of people like to describe it as Middle Eastern. And like, I'm not sure what geography you're studying. It's in Africa, Egypt, Morocco, they're in Africa, so I wanted to highlight those just as equally. But yes, I was very, very anxious about finding that balance. And I'm so glad that you feel that it's balanced because I worked really hard at it. Another thing I had to also ask myself, this is not a textbook. This is my book. This is my story. So I hoped that readers would acknowledge that, well, she's not trying to write a textbook about African food. She's just sharing what she thinks should be at least fundamentals you can start with. And I wrote it quite boldly in my introduction. I said, this is a lot of what I know, what I've experienced, what I've learned, what I'm still learning. But it's only just an invitation for you to take my hand and go on this journey, but also explore by yourself. You know what I mean? And I'm glad that comes through.
I do. And I found one of the, I guess maybe it's a device, it felt like in the most positive way, but some of the more personal recipes that don't have a subtitle that's a traditional dish of a various country, you then in the head note or in the sidebar explain what makes it an African dish, whether it's a spice mix, whether it's a technique. So you've taken your cooking background, your knowledge, your technique, and then flavored it with flavors of Africa.
Yes.
So it is a very personal book, and that comes through. And yeah, we were talking about the personality in some of the recipe writing too, like in I think it's in the Ugandan Rolex.
Yeah, such a fun recipe.
I love it that, well, what you say, it says serves 4 or 2 greedy gobs like me. And I wondered, is that, because I think in the UK cookbooks that are coming out of the UK oftentimes have this a little bit more playfulness with their language. And I think in the US, we're very much, we must write by the rules. We have to say things exactly like in a bowl, using a spoon, fold the ingredients together, blah, blah, blah. And maybe in the UK, there's a little bit more flexibility. But how did you learn how you wanted to write your recipes? Did your teaching background really influence the way that you actually created your instructions?
The basis of my recipe, as when I started writing them, I just wrote how I already wrote. So I teach people and then I write the recipes for them to go home and cook. I'd been writing for magazines and newspapers. So I'd already been writing recipes. So I wrote those recipes how I normally do. That line of greedy gob is something that I've been doing. And I thought, I'm just going to put it in there and hope that my editor doesn't try to change my voice. And I appreciate her. She didn't. What she did was, I write a lot. I write too much almost. So I write like I talk. And that's how I wanted my book to sound, conversational and not instructional. So what she did was just tighten things up. But I said, I'm not looking to write short instructions here. I want people to, every single thing that I know that cooks always wonder or they try to guess, and things that I've learned as a teacher, as a cookery teacher, I try to incorporate, especially when I don't want them to stir too much. I know they're going to try stirring. And then I mention it. I'm like, don't be tempted to stir because I know they're going to stir. So I'm happy that the team that worked on my book trusted, loved, and kept my voice. So I already had that voice. But moving forward and making sure, I wrote a book that was useful, we included things like the extra cook's tips. Those extra tips, because I thought, when I teach, I don't segregate my class. So I don't do, even though when I started my cookery school, it was only plant-based food, even though I'm not vegan. I did that on purpose. I wanted us to focus on flavor and not meat or fish taking the shine. So in the cook's tips, what I do there is I mention if it's a meat recipe, then I give you tips on how you can flip it into a vegan or vegetarian recipe. I give you tips on how to use the extra sauce that's left over, or how to flip the recipe using another ingredient, because that's very African style. In different countries I've been to, I've noticed that this is something that Africans do. We use what we have. So you might make the same dish. Maybe this month you use pumpkins, and when pumpkins aren't available, you use potatoes. We can use spinach, and another time we use potato greens. So I wanted that to come across, because I wanted my cooks to also feel that they could make the recipes their own. People worry a lot about changing your recipe, and I wanted them to know you can change it. You can make it work for you. So those are also things that I developed as I was writing. I try to put myself in the shoes of my reader. If I was reading a cuisine that perhaps I didn't know anything about, what would I want from this book? So that's what I try to incorporate in. Sometimes it felt like I was giving too much, but I just felt, well, this is what I'd like, so I'm just going to give it.
There's a practicality to it, to a lot of the instructions. So
I'm glad.
I think I read that the book was longer than your editor wanted, or your editor wanted a shorter book. Was that
very long? I think I had over 200 recipes. I just couldn't, I struggled to cut them down. Yeah. Now I'm thinking.
I guess that'll be volume 2. You know, you already have
if you say so. And this just goes to show that I was actually struggling to choose which one should stay, which one should go. Mm-hmm. I even snuck in some double recipes. I don't know if you noticed. There's some. Yes. That was very sneaky. So I have a moi moi tart. So moi moi is a very traditional Nigerian style black-eyed bean dish. It's blended. It's like a pudding. It's steamed, and
it's like a cake almost.
Yeah, but very soft. It's supposed to be wrapped in banana leaves, stacked up in a pot with a little water and steamed. But I turned it into a tart so you can bake in the oven. And I did a version with roasted tomatoes and peppers, and another version with mushrooms. I like them both. But I think recipes like that are fun, and it makes my book a little bit different, as opposed to that, one recipe per page type thing. But yeah, I had a lot of recipes that I just struggled to let go of. But then I kept being reminded, this is just your first book. And I'm like, okay.
There you go. Well, and you mentioned one recipe per page, and I noticed the design. I mean, there's so much about the design I'd love to talk about, but it seems that you worked with the design team, or so the recipe instruction would be on one page, and if it was a longer recipe, maybe the head note would have a full color. The head note would move to another page. So they did some very clever things, and the colors of this book are just remarkable. And those chapter openers that really bring forward. And hearing you say you wanted to make sure it wasn't too Nigerian, I was trying to say, what are these colors? I mean, they kind of look like different African fabrics, but they're not country specific. Yes. And I'm just curious how involved you were in the design.
Very involved. Oh my gosh, I'm a control freak. I'm sure
Tell us about it. Yeah.
I'm sure they were nagging about me in the back end, but I thought, the book has my name on it. I need not to be ashamed of my book. I need to be really proud of my book.
We just stop right there. Listeners, listen up, right?
I know.
You have your name on it.
Yes.
Speak up.
Yeah, I was like, this is not being a stroppy author. And, I did have that at the back of my mind. First time author, perhaps, you just got to toe the line. But I'm like, it's my book. It's my name. It's my legacy. And that's another thing. This is not just, how they say sometimes authors' first books are like some kind of, it's like a pet project. For me, this is very important. I want people to read this in schools and kids read. So I needed it to be perfect. So I was very involved in the design process. They matched the font to my favorite fonts that are on my website. They matched it to my favorite colors.
I was talking to Molly yesterday. We were thinking, the font choice, the typography in this book is really nice. Just the way that the fonts work together. They're very subtle. They're different, but they just look like they belong into the same. Yeah. They should be in the same book. Yeah.
No, the book was really heavily designed, but not I mean, you don't necessarily see that, but it was very intentional. Even the color choices, I said I said I'd really like this book. Well, my first choice, I said I'd really like it to be black and gold, and they were like, Lerato, you're a very colorful person. Why would you want a black book? So that was a bit strange on my part. And then I said, well, I do love red and I love golden yellow, and it was always my dream to have some sort of gold on the book because I wanted it to look like a treasure, like something that when you received it, you'd want to like treasure it like a gift. I said, I want the book to look like a very nice, expensive present. Oh yeah, I must tell you, that's my UK edition, by the way, which is different from the US edition.
Oh, well, let's actually talk about that.
Don't cut this out because I want my US publishers to hear it.
Yes, I want to hear about that because your book comes out in the UK. You're known there. We're going to talk a little bit about your kitchen cabinet, the radio show that you're part of. But the book is also out in the US. And just tell us a little bit about what's interesting about that, the challenges of going into a different market,
the timing of it.
It was, when I heard I was like, oh, wow, because sometimes people just get published in one place. And
did you know at the beginning from the get-go that it was going to be a US book too? Or
I think we wanted it to be a worldwide book. But at the time I started writing, I don't think the USA publisher had bought into the book yet. I think it was still in talks.
So at what point did you hear that it was going to be published in the US as well?
After I'd finished the book. After I'd finished writing it, then I heard, oh, wow, it's the same publishers, but different imprint. So the US publishers bought rights to the book. And I was really happy, but I wasn't shocked. We wanted this because I wasn't writing a book for the UK. I was writing a book for the universe.
Right.
So I was happy, I was thrilled, but I wasn't surprised or shocked because that's what we should have been working towards anyway, especially since the US, I feel, more than the UK, have a stronger connection to African foods, especially through culture and the history of slavery and all that. And because of the way the foods have continued to be part of your culture. Yeah, back to your other question, design. There is a country-specific thing in the book, but it's not very obvious. So a lot of the motifs inside, they're actually Ghanaian Adinkra symbols. They're called Adinkra, and they're just symbols that have very strong meaning in Ghana. If you visit Ghana, you would see them on the walls everywhere. So we paired the symbols to certain chapters and certain colors. I'm actually going to talk more about it on my website and socials just to educate people. But I also wanted the design to be something that was meaningful and not random. So all those little symbols that you see across the book, they all have meaning.
They're I can't wait to read about it because they're wonderful and they bring a lot to the book.
So when it comes to, having this book come out in the UK and you get all these great blurbs, like people get really behind this book. How hard was it then to bring your book to the US market? And that happened maybe a few months after the UK book was released?
Yes. Yeah, it was nerve-wracking. But you see, for me, I believe that I know in the publishing world can be very cliquey. But in the UK, I experienced that I wasn't in any clique and my book did well. So I was already sure that I had a good product. But obviously, you've got to do all those, those back-end machinations that happen. You've got to email this author and email that person and ask for a blurb. In the UK, I didn't do any of that. I didn't do any of that. The PR, my publicist will do her job. They'd email people. They do what they normally do. But I personally didn't, because I'm making more friends now. But I'm a food person in the food world. That's not really in the food world. I don't live in London, which is like where all the cool food people are. I live in Sussex on the coast. So either I'm on the coast or I'm somewhere in Africa traveling. So I'm not necessarily in that world per se, even though I work in the world. So I think I manage that quite well. But in the US, I don't really know anyone. I have a few.
Now you know us.
Yeah, I know you. I have a few friends that I made from my newsletter. I have a newsletter on Substack. I don't know if you've heard of it. I've been on it for 2 years. Now it's popular. I've been on it for over 2 years. Made good friends, some popular authors that we've met on Substack. But I'm just not very good at pushing other authors to sort of, because I know a lot of authors do this. You sort of say, oh, can I send you my book? Can I have a blurb? I always feel like if somebody likes it, I'd really like to know naturally. But I've learned now that perhaps you have to be a little bit more pushy and more intentional. Right. But yeah, because I'm sure lots of people are sending lots of books to different people. But I'm still trying to find my way around the US market. One thing that is very important that I'm enjoying is feedback from people buying the book, people reading the book, USA readers and cooks, enjoying the recipes, making that connection with perhaps Cuban food, Puerto Rican food, or American food, because then I can see that they get it, And then for those who have never, it's also very exciting when you talk to people who have never come across plantains and they're enjoying it. They feel like, oh my God, I can't believe I can cook this. Then I know, okay, this works. So it's been exciting. The USA publication still, well, to be honest, the UK publication still feels very fresh. So I'm still sort of working at creating recipes. I noticed that when you make the videos online on social media, it helps people because they can see what it should look like how to cook it. Even though I sort of hate social media. Not hate, but it exhausts me.
We know what you mean. But so you're making recipes from this book and posting reels or videos, and then maybe that takes a recipe that someone might not have thought of making.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and I show them different ways that I switch things up because I'm actually not a cookbook type of cook. I don't follow recipes. So I don't follow recipes. Yeah. So when I have to follow mine, it's always very interesting because I only ever follow mine if I'm being instructional. When I'm cooking at home, I already know the stuff. I just throw this in, a dash of this, a dash of that. And sometimes you want more chili or you want more ginger or more herbs or less of something. So
we're all right there.
Yeah. Testing recipes, making like a recipe that's written out is such a different part of your brain than actually just being in the kitchen and cooking. It's so much easier just like glance at a recipe. Okay, I know this. But for your recipes, I know for me, a lot of these recipes are new to me. So I need your voice and I need your hand holding to know how much you're going to grind the seeds, how much you're going to, blend this to make the soup and all these details. That's what I really appreciate your book are all those specific details that probably would drive you nuts as a cook to read your own recipes. But as for me, I really benefit.
No, I'm glad.
I want to get back a little bit to this UK versus US edition, because how different is the US edition? Did you change things like mince to ground meat? Or ground nuts to peanuts? It's all in metric. I mean, did you make those changes? And if so, were you involved in that?
So I didn't make those changes. The editorial team did, but there was a lot of back and forth to show me. I didn't even realize that in the US you said black-eyed peas. I was like, peas? Right. Okay, I was like, I know the band.
Yeah. So that's where the name comes from.
Yeah, so it was a learning curve for me as well. I didn't realize that those subtle, I know cilantro, coriander, but so I also learned some things that were more natural for you in the US. But the editorial team took care of that with my supervision. So for example, in the UK, I cook a lot, and I wrote this a lot. I cook with what we called cold press rapeseed oil.
Yes.
So it's very golden yellow. In my opinion, it's high up there, because it's really fine oil that's not over refined. And there's this thing with olive oil, if you buy like regular olive oil, you just don't really know what you're buying. There's olive oil mafia. If we're allowed to say
so
that.
True.
So we have UK cold pressed rapeseed oil, which I really love. I use avocado oil. Typical West African cooking, we use a lot of groundnut oil, but I have allergies, so I don't. Well, I have allergies now. I'll tell you more about that later. So in the US, what you call rapeseed oil is canola, which to my understanding is not that great. Am I wrong?
Well, canola oil has become a commodity oil. There are a few small producers that do make a cold press, but it's very hard to find, and it's been a couple years since I've even seen it. So, but you're right. Canola is a supermarket, the word canola comes from Canadian oil because it was originally mostly grown up in Canada, and so it's just a commodity supermarket oil. So you're
so
right.
I'm very careful.
So that would be a big difference.
Yeah, so I'm very careful to label things as, not so great because it's also a personal choice and affordability. So in my book, I mentioned use what you like and what you have. I just make reference to not using oils that are too strongly fragranced in certain dishes so they don't clash. But in adapting the book for the US audience, I noticed that, and I'm glad I did, because I'm not referring to canola oil. I don't use canola oil. And so I started to ask American friends, like, do you have cold pressed rapeseed oil? And one of them was like, that just sounds far too highbrow for the regular man. And I was like, okay, so good idea just to go for sunflower oil or just oil, just regular vegetable oil. I think I may have, you just said vegetable oil. So whatever your preference is. So those subtle differences.
Yeah. And in the front matter, you could say what you might use, but you're also trying to keep your book accessible too. And
yes, because I do say in my pantry section, I mention different oils you can use, my preferences and why. Remember, I really want my cooks to succeed and cook as they want to cook. I'm not very strict in telling people how to eat or what they must buy, because I want everyone to try these dishes, and you've got to give people room to adapt things to suit their lifestyles. So things like that was a learning curve for me. Imagine if I didn't have access to those changes. That would be a really bad change that I wouldn't have been happy with. And then things
It's so true because there's certain things that you say in the UK that you would never say in the US, vice versa. I think something that US recipe writers say a lot is like, toss this on your cake or something. And I think in the UK, toss means to throw up. Like you just wouldn't want to do something to toss.
to throw it away.
I don't know.
Yeah, to throw it away. Oh, we would use toss to refer to tossing a salad or toss it in the bin. Yeah, like flick it in the bin. Yeah. And another learning curve is the measurements. So my USA publishers didn't change the measurements in the main recipe, which I secretly actually loved because I feel like the world should just be, metric.
I agree,
think that
because
was a wise
sometimes
decision.
right, because a 1 cup might be 120 grams, but it might be 140 grams.
Not
it's better
accurate.
to just use your grams.
You agree?
Right?
I'm so glad that the queens of cookbooks.
Right? I don't know if I'd be, I'm not anointed yet, but no, I'm 100% because I think that's something that we've seen sometimes when books are converted, something is lost in translation. And you're just like, especially with, if it's a baking thing or something that's very
it always goes wrong.
Just leave the metrics. We're happy.
And I also, looking at the design of your book, if they had wanted to keep both, it would have been too much in the way your columns are. I really think it was a smart decision. People they can figure out how to do, metric liquid measuring.
So when they sent me their edits, that was one of the first things I checked. Let me see what they did before I tell them what I think we should do. And I noticed they didn't change it. But what they did was at the back, there's a conversion table. Yeah. But that was a risky move, which I'm still happy with that move. Maybe in my next book, I might consider doing it differently. But some readers are not happy about that. I had somebody in a book club who was praising the book and everything, and then went to online and left a 1-star review. What? Complaining that she returned the book because it has metric measurements and she doesn't know how to figure out that. So it is going to upset some people, but if you can't please everyone all the time, right?
And you could have changed the outcome of your recipes unintentionally by just converting to the US sort of volume measurements. Yeah. It's just risky. It's just risky.
And I think something that's interesting, you are clearly a UK author.
Yes.
I mean, you're a Nigerian living in the UK. This is written from a British perspective. And so if they had made the decision to change everything so it seemed like it was written in the US,
it would have been weird.
It would have been weird. It would have been a strange hybrid. So, for example, when you call for ground meat, it still says mince.
Yeah.
It says lamb mince. It doesn't say ground lamb. And I like that because it might take me a minute. Like if I don't know anything about British food, I might have to be like, wait, what's mince? But it doesn't take much to figure it out. So I appreciate these decisions because it carries your personality through without trying to water it down. And
changing things like black-eyed peas is just, that doesn't depict a personality. But my voice is very much still felt across the book. And I really like that. Because remember, this is my first book. I also had to learn, the process and a lot of the decisions made, why they make these decisions. The only decision that I wasn't too, I really, really love my red cover. And I have people from the US saying, no, I want the red one. And I'm like, oh boy. But the USA cover is beautiful, don't you think?
Yes,
right.
absolutely.
But were you involved with the covers, or was that something that your publishers did because they figured, well, we have to do it for this market, it's going to be different?
So the UK cover, I was very involved. I said a lot of no. But the USA cover, because it had a much quicker turnaround as well, because the book was ready. The only thing we changed is the cover and just some notes, some words in the book. It's the same book. The USA cover, they sent me examples. We talked about, I was told they really wanted, and I know you've probably come across this issue, they wanted food on the cover.
Yes.
Because apparently...
That's what we want.
Because apparently
we're very
USA
literal.
people, apparently the red version might look like some kind of Bible or dictionary.
Oh my God. I hadn't even thought of that.
As an American,
I think that's a stretch, but...
As an American, if you saw it in the food section, would you think, oh, is this a Bible in the food section? Oh, well.
We've had many conversations about the covers, and there's one camp that thinks food needs to be on the cover. That's the bigger camp, and others appreciate the sort of more figurative covers. But
I hope I don't piss off my publishers.
I don't think so.
No.
But actually, before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your food tours. You do your classes, you do your writing, your columns, your Substack, and you have this book. But you also, sometimes do food tours. You're on this kitchen cabinet radio show. So it seems like this book is part of like a really vibrant career. Tell us a little bit about the food tours.
Yes, so I've got these retreats. I call it Africana retreats. I actually created these tours pre-pandemic. Obviously, pandemic happened, and I was really sad. I thought, oh my gosh, if there was any other disaster that happened in the world, it would have been nice for us to just escape and travel, but we can't actually travel. So I sort of put that in the back burner. And once we started being able to travel again, I picked that up. So the idea is Africana on tour, practically. It's like you're going on an Africana treat, like in real life. With the book, I take you by the hand, but I'm not really there. But when you travel with me, we're there together, enjoying those things in real life. And I think for a lot of people that come, especially if you're of African descent, it feels like a homecoming. There's this deep connection that I can see in people's faces. They're like, oh, wow, I want to trace my roots.
Yeah. Now Molly and I are rapidly packing suitcases.
Oh. You're welcome. You're welcome.
Amazing. We will put links to that and how people can find you, your books, both editions, US and UK, so people can choose their own cover and all of that in our show notes.
Thank you so much.
I don't know if there's anything else you want to share with us, but we're just so grateful for your time and for this beautiful book.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for all your questions. Yeah. You really went in there. I'm really glad.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more episodes and ways to contact us, go to our website, everythingcookbooks.com. The show is also available on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your audio. And if you like what you hear, please leave us a review. It really helps other people find the show. Any book mentioned on the show can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thank you, as always, to our editor, Abby Circatella. And until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.